In the darkness of very ancient times, across a land where empires rose and fell like breath itself, there lived a boy who asked the gods a question they could not answer. This is not a story of conquest, though he conquered the known world. This is not a story of glory, though his name became legend. This is the story of Alexander of Macedon, and the one thing he was always chasing, the one thing no map could ever hold. Listen, and you will hear the riddle that followed him from birth to death, answered only in fragments, understood only in silence. The palace of Pella was built of stone and shadow. At night, when the torches burned low and the guards walked their eternal corridors, a boy moved through those shadows like a ghost, learning to remember that he was real. His name was Alexander, and he was rarely where he was supposed to be. In the war room, he would trace his fingers across the maps his father had left unrolled, maps of territories conquered, territories yet to be conquered, territories that existed only in the minds of men who dreamed of empire. The scrolls felt warm from the dying fire, and young Alexander would sit in the dark, studying the lines and rivers and mountains as though they held secrets. Sometimes he would imagine himself standing in those distant places, wondering what he would find there. Not victory, not glory, something else, something that had no name. The palace archives were his true home. It was there, in the deepest chamber, buried beneath records of taxes and treaties and the births of princes, that he found it. A sealed bronze box, no larger than his fist, covered in symbols that belonged to no kingdom he knew. Foreign hands had crafted it. Foreign hands had hidden it away. And when young Alexander held it up to the lamplight, he felt something stir in his chest, a certainty that this small, sealed thing held an answer to a question he had not yet learned to ask. He brought it to his chamber and kept it hidden, and he never spoke of it to anyone. Not to his father, Philip, the king of Macedon, not to his mother, Olympia, the priestess who claimed the gods whispered their secrets to her alone. Not even to Aristotle, the philosopher who came to tutor him in the ways of reason and logic, but the box remained with him. And in the years that followed, when priests came to the palace with tales of the omens that surrounded his birth, how the priestess Olympia had dreamed of a thunder-struck womb, how 3 omens had come on the same night: the burning of the great temple at Ephesus, the escape of the wild beast from its cage, the conquest of the city of Potidea by his father's general. Alexander would hold the sealed box and wonder, were these stories crafted to make him believe he was destined, or were they warnings, whispered by time itself, that something was coming that should not be named? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. In Macedon, destiny was a thing that happened to other people. For Alexander, it felt more like a hunger. Oh, and hunger never sleeps. The kingdom of Macedon was not built on dreams. It was built on iron and will, and the kind of ambition that wore armor and learned the language of steel. Philip II, Alexander's father, was a man who had turned a tribal kingdom into an empire. His generals commanded armies that marched like clockwork. His smiths worked through the night, forging sarissa spears, longer than any weapon the Greek city-states possessed. His strategy was the strategy of a man who did not believe in patience, only in the swift execution of what others were too afraid to imagine. And in this kingdom of iron and ambition, there walked a boy who watched everything. Alexander did not attend war councils as a student. He attended them as a silent evaluator. He would sit in the corner of the room, half hidden by shadow, and listen to the generals argue about tactics, about timing, about the psychology of enemies. He learned how a word at the right moment could turn a man's loyalty. He learned how fear moved through a crowd like wind through wheat. He learned that power was not something you possessed, it was something you understood. But there was another education happening in those war rooms, one that no teacher could have designed. The nobles of Macedon watched the boy grow, and they began to recognize in him something dangerous. A mind that saw further than their own, an ambition that did not rest, a kind of presence that made them uneasy. Some whispered that he was becoming too curious, too questioning, too ready to surpass the king who had given him life. Philip knew, of course he knew. He had built his empire by understanding the hearts of men, and his own son's heart was the easiest to read, a book written in the language of hunger and shadows. But between the king and the boy, there was something more than rivalry. There was admiration. There was love. And there was the terrible knowledge, shared in silence between them, that one day the boy would need to become a man by doing what no man truly wants to do, outgrow the one who made him. The palace corridors grew colder with the weight of that unspoken truth. And then, on a night like any other, the threads that held everything together began to unravel. The death of Philip II did not come with thunder or prophecy. It came with a knife in a moment, in the confusion of a parade, and it left the kingdom gasping like a fish torn from water. When the news reached Pella, the palace erupted into a kind of organized chaos. Generals began moving pieces on invisible boards. Nobles gathered in shadowed corners, speaking in voices too low to hear. The kingdom was suspended between kings, between a dead father and a son who was barely old enough to grow a beard, let alone rule an empire. Alexander stood in the war room as the torches burned, and he was perfectly still. Around him, men older and wearier than he could ever be were watching, waiting to see what he would do. Would he break? Would he hide? Would he run? The boy who had traced maps in the dark, who had carried a sealed bronze box through every year of his youth, who had learned to read the hearts of men by listening in the shadows. That boy took a breath and became someone new. He moved through the kingdom with a calm that was almost eerie. He did not punish his rivals hastily. He did not make speeches about his birthright. Instead, he spoke to the soldiers. He walked among them without guards, remembering their names, remembering their families. He spoke to the generals, not as a boy asserting authority, but as a young man who had been listening, always listening to what they truly wanted. By the time the sun had set on the third day after his father's death, the kingdom had chosen, not because they had to, but because somehow this boy who had lived in shadows had become a light that they recognized, a light they could follow into whatever darkness came next. There was no time for grief. There was only the understanding that everything had changed, and that what came next would require all of him. The campaigns that followed moved with the speed of thought itself. Alexander rode through dawn and dust, and soldiers who had fought under his father's banner began to believe that something new had come into the world. Not just a king, but a commander who would stand with them in the mud and rain. He remembered the names of men no one else remembered. He knew when to push and when to wait. He knew how to speak to fear and transform it into something resembling courage. But there was something else, too. Something that moved beneath the surface of all his victories like a current beneath a river. A hunger. A need to move forward, to reach further, to find something that slipped away each time he thought he held it. In the night councils, held under skies fractured with stars, Alexander would study maps by firelight, his fingers tracing routes to territories he had not yet seen. And sometimes, a messenger would arrive with a message written in a cipher only he could read, a message that seemed to come from nowhere and from everywhere at once, containing information that no one should have known, altering his plans in ways that seemed guided by something beyond mere chance. His generals began to whisper about it. Was their king receiving guidance from the gods? Or was there another hand at work, moving pieces on a board that stretched further than any map showed. Alexander never answered these questions, but he began to understand something his father had perhaps never fully grasped: that ambition alone was not enough to sustain a man. You also needed to be afraid. You needed to feel the possibility of loss. You needed to sense, always, that the thing you were chasing might slip away forever if you did not keep moving. And so he kept moving, northward, then southward, then toward the one horizon that had never been crossed, the east. The Hellespont was not wide. Only a few miles of water separated Europe from Asia. But as Alexander stood on the shore, watching his army prepare to cross, he felt something shift in the world itself. The wind changed direction. The light fell differently across the water. It was as though the earth itself was turning away from what had been and opening toward what was to come. His soldiers threw offerings into the sea: coins, weapons, prayers written on scraps of parchment. Each offering was a bargain with the unknown. Let us live, let us return, let us be transformed by what we find, but not destroyed by it. At Troy, where the ancients said the greatest war had been fought, Alexander left an offering of his own. He stood in the ruins of a civilization that had risen and fallen while the world moved on, and he felt something that was very close to fear, and very close to reverence. "I am coming," he whispered to the stones, to the ghosts, to whatever gods might be listening. "I am coming to be worthy of the legends that have come before. Or I am coming to make new legends that will consume the old ones entirely." The words were foolish, perhaps. The words of a young man who did not yet understand the true weight of ambition. But the gods, if they were listening, seemed to smile at the audacity of it. The Battle of Granicus came swiftly after. His enemies thought he was trapped, caught between a river and an enemy army too vast to overcome. They had prepared their tactics carefully. They had studied strategy and logistics and the mathematics of war. But Alexander did not fight the way they expected. He attacked at dawn when the light was still uncertain. He moved with a kind of recklessness that seemed guided by instinct rather than reason. His soldiers followed him because they had begun to believe that following him meant surviving the unsurvivable. When the battle was over, the field was transformed into something from a nightmare. Blood diluted in the river water, half-buried spears, the silence that comes after great violence. Alexander moved across the field alone, stepping carefully between the fallen, his face unreadable. It was then that his generals began to understand. Their king did not fight for glory. He fought as though he were searching for something, and every victory was a step closer to wherever he thought it was. Across the deserts and mountains that stretched between them, another man was beginning to understand that his kingdom was in danger. Darius III was the king of Persia, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known. His palace was so vast that men could spend their entire lives within its walls and never see all of it. The halls were hung with silk so fine they seemed to be woven from light itself. The air was perfumed with incense that had traveled from lands so distant that their names were lost in time. And in the deepest chambers, where only the closest advisors were allowed, Darius sat and watched the reports come in about this young man from Macedon. At first, he had dismissed Alexander as a problem for generals to solve, but as the months passed, as report after report arrived showing cities falling, armies defeated, impossible victories achieved, Darius began to understand that he was facing not an enemy, but a force of nature. A storm that moved with intention. A hunger that took the form of a young man. And yet, there was something strange in the reports. Something that did not fit the pattern of typical conquest. Alexander was showing mercy to the peoples he defeated. He was adopting their customs, learning their languages, speaking to them not as a conqueror, but as a student. He was collecting their stories, their myths, their understanding of the world. And more strangely still, Darius had begun to suspect, though he could never quite prove it, that Alexander was trying to reach him. That somewhere in the shadows of courts and the spaces between official communications, the young king was searching for a way to speak to the old one, not in battle, but in something deeper, in understanding. At the Battle of Issus, when they finally faced each other across the blood-soaked earth, Darius did something that historians would puzzle over for centuries. He fled. Not in panic, but in a kind of deliberate withdrawal, as though he was choosing to leave the field, to remove himself from the game, as though he understood something about Alexander that Alexander had not yet understood about himself. In the aftermath, Alexander discovered something that shook him to his core. Darius's family, his wife, his daughters, his mother, had been left behind in the palace. Defenseless, abandoned. Alexander could have destroyed them, could have used them as leverage, as punishment, as tools of power. Instead, he treated them with a gentleness that seemed strange, coming from a man whose hands were still wet with blood. He gave them chambers in the palace. He ensured they were guarded and safe. He visited them and spoke to them with a courtesy that was almost courtly. His generals asked him why. His advisors questioned the mercy, and Alexander found that he could not answer them. He knew only that when he looked at Darius's family, he saw something of himself, the loneliness that comes from power, the weight of survival, the terrible knowledge that you might lose everything you love before you understood why you were fighting at all. And in that moment, as he stood in the palace of his enemy, surrounded by the treasures of conquest, Alexander noticed something carved into a stone pillar. A symbol. The same symbol that had been on the sealed bronze box from his childhood. He stopped. He stared at it for a very long time. And then he understood that his own journey was larger than he had believed. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of sand and stone where the sky and earth seemed to merge into a single burning horizon. Alexander's army moved through it like a ghost fleet, following maps that were hardly more than rumors, guided by priests and nomads who spoke of a temple in the dunes, where the gods still gave voice to the future. The Oracle of Siwa. The journey took weeks. The sand was relentless. Men died of thirst and heat. Animals collapsed. And through it all, Alexander moved forward, driven by something that had grown beyond mere curiosity. He needed to know. He needed to hear from the gods themselves what the future held, what the sealed box from his childhood meant, what all of this hunger and searching had been about. When the temple finally appeared, a structure so ancient it seemed carved from the very stone of creation, Alexander went inside alone. What passed between the oracle and the young king was never recorded. The priests who were waiting outside heard nothing. No voice, no words. Only, after a time, the sound of footsteps. When Alexander emerged, he was changed. His face held an expression that no one could read. Joy, sorrow, a kind of terrible understanding. He told no one what the oracle had said. Not his closest companions, not his generals, not even the priests who had guided him through the desert. But he knew, whatever the oracle had revealed, it had confirmed something. Or perhaps it had shattered something, and he was already learning to live with the pieces. It was in that place, standing on the edge of the known world, that Alexander made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would build a city. Here, in the midst of the desert, where east and west could meet, where all peoples could come together. He would name it after himself, and it would outlive him. It would outlive empires. It would stand as a monument not to conquest but to something else, something he could not quite name. Alexandria rose from the sand like a dream taking form. Streets were drawn. Visions were spoken into being, and Alexander moved among the builders like a man possessed by the knowledge that he was creating something that would live long after his own bones had turned to dust. The trek through Central Asia was unlike anything Alexander had experienced before. The mountains reached so high they seemed to pierce the sky itself. The passes were choked with snow and ice. The stars above were unfamiliar, arranged in configurations that Macedonian astronomers did not recognize. The very air felt different, as though the world was becoming stranger, more alien, more real with every step. And with each step eastward, something changed in Alexander himself, the boy who had traced maps in the darkness of Pella's war rooms, the young man who had conquered the known world, the king who had built Alexandria in the desert. All of these versions of himself seemed to fall away, layer by layer, until what remained was something new, something that no longer quite fit the shape of a man. He became isolated, not by circumstance, but by choice. The walls that had always surrounded him grew higher and more impenetrable. Even those who loved him, his generals, his companions, found themselves kept at a distance. Alexander was learning something, the historians would later say. But what? What could there possibly be left to learn when you had conquered everything? The answer came in blood and tears and a moment of such terrible clarity that it seemed to shatter something in the world. Clytus, his childhood companion, his closest friend, the man who had ridden beside him through every battle, who had known him before he was a legend, who remembered him as he truly was, in a night of wine and words, and the kind of conversation that only happens when men have survived too much together. They argued. The details of their argument would be disputed by historians for centuries. But the truth was simple and terrible. Clytus, drunk on wine and truth, reminded Alexander of what he had been before hunger, before destiny, before the sealed box from childhood had opened to reveal mysteries that transformed him. And Alexander, in a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rage, from some place where all his hunger and searching had accumulated like blood in a wound, drew a sword and killed him. In the aftermath, alone in his chamber, Alexander wept. Not for Clytus, though he wept for him too, but for something else, for the realization that in chasing what he could not name, he was losing the very things that made him human, for the understanding that the person he had become was not the person he had intended to be. It was in this darkness that Roxana found him. She was a princess from the east, the daughter of a conquered kingdom. She had been brought to the palace as part of the spoils of war. But when she looked at Alexander in those dark hours after Clytus's death, she saw something that no one else saw. Not a king, not a legend, but a man who was breaking apart into pieces and who had no one to catch him. She touched the places that other people could not reach. She spoke in languages that other people did not know, and slowly the fragmented parts of him began to find their way back toward wholeness. But it was a wholeness built on loss, on the understanding that every step forward was a step away from something beloved. In the eastern nights, under foreign constellations, Alexander kept the sealed bronze box close. And finally, he thought he understood what it had meant. Not a prophecy, not a secret, but a symbol of the very thing he was experiencing now, a container for all the mysteries that life holds, which cannot be opened without changing the person who opens it. India crashed over them like a monsoon. The rain fell so heavily it seemed to be falling upward as well as down. Elephants emerged from the mist like ghosts of creatures that should not exist. The cities were ancient beyond measure, and they hummed with rituals and languages that seemed to come from the beginning of time itself. Alexander's soldiers had followed him across deserts and mountains. They had crossed rivers and valleys. They had believed, with an almost religious fervor, that their king could lead them anywhere, and they would emerge victorious. But at the Hephaestus River, something broke. The soldiers refused to go further. It was not rebellion exactly, but it was a kind of quiet, absolute refusal. They had been marching for years. They were exhausted. They were far from home, and they had begun to understand what Alexander had only recently begun to understand, that there was no end to this journey, that conquest was not a destination, that the thing Alexander was chasing would never be reached. The rain fell on them as they stood on the riverbank, and Alexander tried to convince them. He spoke of glory. He spoke of destiny. He spoke of all the things that had driven them forward until this moment. But the soldiers heard something else in his words. They heard desperation. They heard a man who was beginning to realize that he had taken them on a journey not toward something but away from something, and that they could not follow him any further. It was the moment of truth, the moment when Alexander, for the first time in his life, had to confront the possibility that he was not invincible, that even legends must bend, that even destiny has limits. And in that moment, standing in the rain on the banks of a river that would not be crossed, Alexander understood the answer to the riddle that had followed him since childhood. He had been chasing his own humanity. The sealed box had been locked because some mysteries cannot be opened without destroying the very thing you are. The oracle's secret had been the knowledge that power and loneliness are two sides of the same coin. The symbol that echoed through Persia and the East had been a map of his own heart, telling him that everyone is exploring the same territories. Everyone is searching for the same thing. Everyone is desperately trying to understand what it means to be alive in a world that is, finally, far too large for any one person to contain. The journey back was a descent into shadow. The Gedrosian desert was not like other deserts. It was active, malevolent. Burning winds that stripped skin, sand dunes that swallowed entire companies of soldiers, a sun that seemed to have a personal vendetta against every living thing. Alexander moved through it like a ghost of himself, already half returned to the spirit world, the enthusiasm of conquest replaced by something that looked very much like acceptance. Babylon rose before him like a dream, like a reckoning, like the last act of a play that had gone on too long. The city was alive with omens. Strange star patterns moved across the night sky in configurations that had no explanation. The priests grew increasingly uneasy. The birds behaved strangely. The very stones seemed to whisper warnings that no one could quite translate. Alexander spent long nights alone with his maps, his hands trembling as he traced the routes of his campaigns. He studied the distances between places he had been, the spaces between victories, the gaps that could never quite be filled. And he seemed, in those final nights, to be adding up a sum that could never equal the whole. The historians would argue forever about how he died. Some claimed it was illness, fever, poisoning, a wound that had never properly healed. Some claimed it was exhaustion, the simple fact that a human body, even a king's body, could only endure so much before it surrendered. Some even whispered that the gods themselves had called him home, unable to bear watching one of their own suffer the weight of too much achievement. But no one truly knew. The sources disagreed so completely that it seemed the truth had been deliberately hidden or deliberately scattered, as though the universe itself was refusing to let Alexander's death be simple or clear or finally resolved. In Pella, on a night when the wind moved through the stone corridors as it always had, someone found a small sealed bronze box. Where it came from no one could say. Whether it had been placed there deliberately or had always been there, waiting for the right person to discover it, the records do not tell us. The box was never opened. Instead, it was placed in an archive, and it remains there still, a mystery among mysteries, a question that has outlived the man who carried it. Alexander's cities bear his name to this day. The kingdoms he built fragmented and dispersed like water returning to the sea, but the influence he had was not merely political or military. It was something deeper. He changed how people thought. He proved that the world was not as large as people had believed. He showed that one person, driven by hunger and vision, could reshape the entire face of civilization. But the greatest empire he built was not carved into the world with swords and strategy. It was carved into the imagination of every age that followed. In the minds of philosophers and poets and dreamers, Alexander continues to move eastward, always seeking, always questing, always reaching toward that one thing that slips just beyond the grasp, the meaning beneath the conquest, the purpose beneath the power, the love beneath the legend. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of all. Perhaps that was always the real empire. Not the lands conquered, but the inspiration left behind. Not the battles won, but the question they raised. What am I searching for when I search for greatness? What am I running toward when I run from doubt? Alexander never found the answer. But in the asking, in the endless, driven, desperate asking, he somehow remade the world. And so the story returns to where it began, to the opening riddle, to the whispered question that followed Alexander from birth to death and beyond. He was chasing something no map could hold, and in the end, perhaps we all are. In the darkness of very ancient times, in the spaces between stars, in the silences between heartbeats, the sealed box remains sealed. The mystery remains unresolved. And somewhere in the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon that humans can see, a figure on horseback keeps riding, not toward conquest, but toward understanding. And he will keep riding forever, because the only true destiny is the journey itself. Sleep well and dream of empires built not of stone, but of wonder.